here with Chris Hicks now to talk about that. Chris, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's always a pleasure. Appreciate you coming on. And when you've come on the show in the past, you've said that you are in favor of the death penalty. Is that still your stance?
It is.
Okay, so explain just briefly, to start us off, why?
Well, whenever you're discussing the death penalty, it's very important to start with two topics. And one is just how sparingly and judiciously prosecutors use it. And the other is victims. Both of those are often lost in this discussion. But when it comes to whether or not we're going to seek the death penalty in a murder, we take that so incredibly seriously as prosecutors. We staff it in my office with a death penalty review team. We consider all the facts, we consider the evidence, we consider mitigating facts against the accused. And so we make a very reasoned and judicious response in making that decision. And so if you look at, for example, the last two death penalty cases in Washoe County, in the last 11 years, we've only sought and received it twice. And that was one was Tamir Hamilton, which was just a horrific murder. This was a man who raped a 20-year-old woman repeatedly, and then 2 weeks later, raped a 16-year-old girl, tortured her, stabbed her 40 times, and then nearly decapitated her when he killed her. And this was in her mom's apartment. And when you're dealing with, and then you have Mr. Bila as well, who abducted 2 university students, kidnapped them, raped them violently, and then ultimately abducted Breonna Dennison and killed her, left her lifeless body in a vacant field naked. And so we're talking about the worst of the worst, and that's who we reserve it for. In that 11 years that we've only sought and received those 2 death penalties, we prosecuted and reviewed hundreds of homicides. So it's important to know that prosecutors look at these things so closely, and we make sure that it's the right defendant, it's the right crime, and there's an overwhelming amount of evidence. We would never seek the death penalty if that weren't the case, and that's often lost. And then the other thing is the victims. You can't imagine, nor would you ever want to, what some of these victims have gone through. And then you also have to remember what their families have gone through. Lives are destroyed because of the acts of some of these most heinous murderers. And so in that regard, in the right case, in the right circumstance, I'm absolutely for the death penalty. And the vast majority of the state of Nevada is. A poll last year, before the legislature, had it polling at 66% amongst all political ideologies in our state. And so I'm a believer in the right case, and I think most Nevadans are.
For 3 months, we searched these hills looking for these kids. We had multiple airplanes to cover the land because it's so vast. Once there was no sign of them, we just had this feeling that they weren't above ground.
In December 2018, Bill Powell started searching for his son, and Amanda Hunt started searching for her niece. The teenagers had gone missing in the small mining town of Eureka, Utah.
Pretty positive that they were murdered here.
She nailed next to the hole there, and then
And people would have been.
The bodies of 17-year-old Breezy Ottenson and her boyfriend, 18-year-old Riley Powell, were eventually found. They'd been stabbed and thrown 100 feet into a mine shaft near the town. Police charged a man named Jared Baum with the murders. He has a long criminal history and is accused of kidnapping and killing the teenagers in a jealous rage after they visited his girlfriend. The case is now part of a debate over what justice looks like in a state that's wrestling with the death penalty.
when they first brought us to the prosecutor's office, they explained everything to us. And they said that he could possibly die for what he did.
Well, they asked us what we wanted.
And what did you say?
Capital punishment.
Death penalty, for sure. There's no rehabilitation that would work for him because he's proven that nothing works. So why keep babying him? Just take care of business.
There are almost no issues where I don't understand both sides. Taxation, the size of government, abortion, socialism, capitalism. As strongly as I feel about any issue, I understand the opposition. But there is an exception, the death penalty for murder. Here, the gulf is unbridgeable between those of us who believe that some murderers, and I emphasize some murderers, should be put to death, and those who believe that no murderer should ever be put to death. Take this example. On the afternoon of July 23, 2007, in the town of Cheshire, Connecticut, two men broke into the home of Dr. William Pettit, his wife Jennifer, and his two daughters. The men beat Dr. Pettit nearly to death with a baseball bat. One of the men raped the doctor's wife, and the other man sexually assaulted their 11-year-old daughter, Michaela. The two men then strangled Mrs. Pettit to death, tied down the two daughters on beds, doused them with gasoline, and while the girls were still alive, set the house on fire. Dr. Pettit survived, but his wife and daughters did not. Those opposed to capital punishment believe that these two men have a right to keep their lives. So, is there anything a person can do to deserve the death penalty? To those opposed to capital punishment, the answer is no. In fact, many opponents of capital punishment believe that killing murderers is the same as murder. You heard me right. Most opponents equate the murder of an innocent family with putting the murderers of that family to death. Opponents of capital punishment also argue that keeping all murderers alive sanctifies the value of human life. But the opposite is true. Keeping every murderer alive cheapens human life because it belittles murder. That's easily proven. Imagine that the punishment for murder were the same as the punishment for driving over the speed limit. Wouldn't that belittle murder and thereby cheapen human life? Of course it would. Society teaches how bad an action is by the punishment it metes out. And what about the pain inflicted on the loved ones of those murdered? For most people, their suffering is immeasurably increased, knowing that the person who murdered their family member or friend and who in many cases inflicted unimaginable terror, is alive and being cared for. Of course, putting the murderer to death doesn't bring back their loved one, but it sure does provide some sense of justice. That's why Dr. Pettit, a physician whose life is devoted to saving lives, wants the murderers of his wife and daughters put to death. In his words, death is really the only true just punishment for certain heinous and depraved murders. Is the doctor wrong? Is he immoral? Well, if you think capital punishment is immoral, then Dr. Pettit is immoral. And what about opponents' argument that an innocent person may be executed? This argument may be sincerely held, but it's not honest. Why? Because opponents of capital punishment oppose the death penalty even when there is absolute proof of the murderer's guilt. If there were a video of a man burning a family alive, opponents of capital punishment would still oppose taking that man's life. Moreover, by keeping every murderer alive, many more people are murdered, other prisoners, guards, and people outside of prison in case of escape or early release, than the infinitesimally small number of people who might be wrongly executed. And now with DNA testing and other advanced forensic tools, it is virtually impossible to execute an innocent person. Then there is the argument offered by some people in the name of religion that only God has the right to take human life. I always wonder what religion these people are referring to, since the holiest book of no religion of which I am aware ever made that claim. People just make that argument up. So if you're on the proverbial fence on this issue, please ask yourself this question. Do you really believe that the torturers, rapists, murderers of Dr. William Pettit's wife and daughters, and evil men like them, deserve to keep their lives? If you're like most people, your answer is no. Your heart, your mind, your whole being cries out for some justice and fairness in this world. But if you really do believe these people deserve to keep their lives, well, as I said at the outset, I don't understand you.